Hi listeners and welcome to another archive episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So we have gone, if we've gone, this is true archive, we have gone way back. So this is a very, very early episode where we looked at the animated I think the text when it comes to animated documentaries.
Yeah, I feel like this is an episode we cite quite a few times when we're talking about other animated documentaries.
Yes,
probably quite lazily of us because obviously we've done many since, but this was our first. This was, it's one that often people see as the go-to example.
Yes, it was July 2019, good heavens. So it was really only episode 24, but we were joined, we thought, okay, if we're going to do animated documentary, we've got to get on Bella Honess Roe, so author of the animated documentary. So I suppose her book, Animated Documentary, is the Waltz with Bashir of text on animated documentary. So a film that has been written about lots and lots and lots. So we were delighted to get kind of Bella on to talk about fantasy and animation and how one could then apply those ideas to, I think when we did it kind of for the first time on the podcast to non-fiction. So lots of stuff on animation and catharsis and release and politics and trauma. Whether or not animation, again, stuff that we've talked about since many, many times, animation's ability to negotiate the real, its relationship to dreams and memory, as I said, and kind of national history as well, whether it dilutes, whether it amplifies kind of political moments, history, etc., etc. So, yeah, it was, we don't, as you said before, and some of these, I don't think I've listened back to it since, so goodness knows what we sounded like, but I remember the conversation. I remember feeling proud that we at least got somewhere with the film that Bella herself hadn't. Like there was a bit where we talked about the ending a lot of the film, where it shifts to live action.
Yeah, we talked a lot about the ending, if I remember rightly, so you can all enjoy that.
Yeah, so that was a really, a good one, and goodness me, 7 years old, but yeah.
Such is time.
Yes.
Anyway, enjoy the episode.
So today we are covering our first animated documentary, Waltz with Bashir, so a film from 2008 that covers the 1982 Lebanon War, and in particular the Shabra and Shatila massacre as part of this sort of Israeli history. It's really a test case for us, Alex, I think. It's a test case to play out some ideas with fantasy and animation to see whether or not those ideas, those mediums, those media work within a non-fiction context. And obviously it's our first chance to think about the relationship between documentary and animation and documentary and fantasy.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're always conscious on this podcast about is that fantasy and animation are two words that can mean lots and lots of things to lots and lots of different people. And we're keen to sort of test out where these words can go and can't go. And one of the often sort of counterexamples we get are animated documentaries. What do you do with them? Do they count in terms of this relationship? So that's going to be an interesting thing to talk about.
So to help us solve this new portion of the show, which is the fantasy animation riddle, we're delighted to welcome Bella Honess Roe. So Bella is a senior lecturer and programme director for film studies at the University of Surrey, and she's the author of Animated Documentary, which was the recipient of the 2015 Society for Animation Studies McLaren Lambert Award for Best Book. She's also co-edited books on the voice in documentary and a recent book on kind of animation history and theory, I guess, titled The Animation Studies Reader. And she's also the editor of a forthcoming collection on Aardman animations. And finally, she spearheaded the important Breaking the Glass Frame research network on women in animation, and she's written a lot in this area and sort of the relationship between national cinema animation and the focus on women in British animation. And she's also working currently on a research project on the visual culture of the invisible. So Bella, thank you for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So what we normally do, and regular listeners will be familiar with this trope, this motif of the show, is to relate the film choice, in this case Waltz with Bashir, to your own personal interest. So I mentioned your work in animated documentary. So I guess our first question is really, how did you come to the film? What's your interest in the film, and perhaps relating it back to your own work, its significance to your own work in animated documentary?
Okay, so I first came to the film because between 2005 and 2009, I was working on my PhD, which was on animated documentary, which wasn't very much written about then. And it also, there weren't very many examples of animated documentary then, or at least nowhere near as many as there are now. So I would, as you do when you're working on a PhD, you would meet people and they'd be like, what you do? So I'm doing a PhD in film studies. They'd be like, what's your PhD on? And I'd say animated documentary. And then people would inevitably look at me and go, is there such a thing?
Yeah. Is that even a thing?
Is that a thing? Do they even exist? So I spent a long time explaining about kind of festival short films and some films that were made on television, maybe connecting to things like Aardman's Creature Comforts film. And then while I was working on my PhD, while I was writing the thesis, this film came out, Waltz with Bashir in 2008, for which I was just massively grateful because there was a feature-length animated feature that people was getting a lot of attention at the time. It was screened at Cannes. It won a Golden Globe, I think that's correct. And it received a lot of critical attention. So there was a film that I could say, have you heard of this film that's come out? I'm writing about that. And also because it was a really interesting film and it did a lot of interesting things in terms of the way I was thinking about animated documentary. And in particular, a chapter of my PhD that then became a chapter of my book about animation and documentary and memory, and how animation can become a really useful tool for making films about the past and your own past, or at least the past of the subject of the documentary.
So actually the film is really important for the trajectory of animated documentary studies, obviously, that you have been at the forefront of, but the film comes out, you're writing about animated documentary, and suddenly you have a text to latch onto. It's something that people have heard of and is sort of doing well.
And it also sort of came around the time that lots of other people started thinking about animated documentary, or at least there was much more interest about animated documentary. There was a conference the year later, I think it was, in Edinburgh, so it felt like it was this sort of real crucible moment, and the film was part of that, of sort of reigniting an interest in animated documentary. And there had been some scholarship sort of 10 years or so earlier, and it all sort of like was coming to a head again, or coming sort of to being enlivened again. So, and I think the film in part was, played a role in that because, it got attention, so it got people interested in animated documentaries, and then people started thinking about other animated documentaries, and sort of a bit of a snowball.
And presumably the kind of history of animated documentary then, if you're saying the scholars are writing about it, it would be interesting, and hopefully we can get your thoughts on the film's relationship to sort of traditions of animated documentary, that the animated documentary didn't begin with Waltz with Bashir, but as you said, it becomes a kind of interesting way of thinking about perhaps some things that cinema and animation had done previously. So that's the sort of relationship to animation and documentary. Alex, as the fantasist, what have we got?
Yeah, okay. Well, actually, before that, I wanted to jump in with my impossible question of the week early this week. This one goes to Bella.
Excellent.
Because I remember the movie coming out, and I can remember a lot of people going, "Have you seen this thing? It's a documentary, but it's animated," as if this was like the first, like some sort of Snow White moment for animated documentaries. And I wondered, just why did that happen? Is it simply because the film's very powerful, that it's very well made? Was it a right place, right time moment? Because I think that it did a lot to popularise the history of animated documentary, certainly within a certain subset of audiences. And I don't know, do we any speculative reasons as to why it did that?
Why it ignited interest?
Yeah.
I think because it was a feature-length animated documentary that was widely commercially available. So a lot of the stuff that I was writing about that was made prior to that were short films that were only really screened publicly at film festivals, animation festivals. They were quite niche, basically, and there was some stuff that was shown on television as well, but I think it was for a great part to do with accessibility. It was also an animated film that was aimed at adults in the cinema, whereas, and as you've talked about on this podcast before, animation and children's entertainment are closely aligned, so it was a feature film that was accessible and aimed at adults, and therefore sort of gained interest and attention. So I think that, and it's interesting that thing you say about like people going, "Oh, it's animated, it's a documentary." Actually, like in the film awards, it was not nominated in documentary categories. It was nominated in best foreign film categories. So I think the filmmakers talk about it being an animated documentary, but I don't know that it was necessarily marketed.
That's what I was actually going to say.
Was it nominated for best animation?
No, best foreign language.
So I've got a list of, and this is taken from the web, but as you said, it won a Golden Globe for best foreign language film, a Caesar Award for best foreign film. and it looked and was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film and a BAFTA Award for the Best Film not in an English language. The only category it says that it was nominated for as an animated film was an Annie Award for Best Animated Feature. So there's something really interesting, I think, about the institutional frames in which... And we've talked informally about the book, Fantasy Animation, and where it goes in a library, and how we think about archiving these texts and where we put them, and how the archiving practice has shaped the way that we then go on to think about these texts. So it's interesting that a film like this doesn't appear, or where it appears in relation to awards. Not that awards tell the whole story,
It's got three identities.
Yeah.
It's a foreign language movie, it's an animation, it's a documentary, and it seems foreign language still trumps the other two in terms of Anglophobic sort of Oscar ceremonies and things like that. It's interesting.
And I think also, I mean, a lot of it is to do with those awarding academies, that they can be quite conservative in terms of, so, it's... there might have been challenges with it fitting into either the documentary or the animation category because of sort of inherent conservatism.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So if it's nestling with or jostling with all these identities, fantasy, animated, documentary, foreign language, is it also a fantasy? I guess.
Well, it's not a fantasy film in terms of a genre. Obviously, it's not riffing on fantasy storytelling.
Obviously,
tropes.
Interesting. It's not.
And I think the jury's out on whether we're going to class this as a fantasy or whether classing it as a fantasy is even the right term. But I certainly think there are discourses of fantasy within the film, and there are interesting things surrounding. Bella's always mentioned the role of memory within the movie. The sort of the self-conscious discussion of subjectivity and subjective memory. There's even sort of a discussion on memory and how we use our imagination almost to fill in gaps in memory, and it's sort of inviting us to read the movie as this sort of imaginative memory trope, right? There's lots on trauma, there's lots on hallucinations, there's lots on dreaming, and there are lots of sequences in the film that deliberately avoid any kind of representational dialogue with real life, so to speak. So what it chooses to document, I think, would be an interesting conversation to have. But I definitely think there are ways of unpacking this movie that can involve discussing either psychological theories of fantasy, or indeed fantasy as a broader trope or impulse that sort of allows us to talk about things that otherwise realist representation doesn't get us at. I don't know if Bella's now going to violently disagree with me.
No, I don't violently disagree with you. I just think that...
Well, it's on radio, so you can do whatever you want.
So people won't see.
I just think it's interesting how Chris introduced the film as a film being about sort of Israeli history. And for me, it's a film, and I think lots of people who've written about this film, it's a film about memory. Rather than the film about that moment in history. And I think as a film about memory, it embraces the idea that memory is made up of the factual and the fantasy, right? And I think that's not just kind of a made-up idea. I think it's sort of like an acknowledged sort of idea of the how psychology of memory works and how we fill in the gaps. So I think in that sense, while it's not sort of a fantasy film in terms of, Snow White or something like that, or being set in an alternative world, it is engaging with the idea of fantasy. And interestingly to me, the role that fantasy plays in understanding our own past, so through memory.
Well, there's a line in the film that's memory takes, I can't remember who says it in particular, but memory takes us where we need to go. And you could take out memory and put animation. Animation takes us where we need to go. And you could take it out and put fantasy. Fantasy takes us where we need to go. So I think there is something about the collapse of those sorts of distinctions, or something about the relationship between fantasy. As you say, it's not fantasy in the generic sense, but you said to me after the screening that it's fantasy in a kind of an impulse, that there are moments of fantasy in the film that perhaps allow it to at least be discussed in that way.
Well, I certainly think what I found interesting watching it was that there are some sequences that really caught this sort of, obviously we're not representing anything now, we're trying to depict a dream that has taken place in reality. It's that question of documenting, I guess. Like, what's the opening sequence with the sort of the dogs running through the street is documenting someone's dream in certain degrees, right? And then there are other sequences that are trying through rotoscope. I assume it's rotoscope, but this is why I'm a fantasy guy. It looks a bit like rotoscope to me.
What a loser! Yeah. Oh god.
It's digital cutout
So
animation.
what is that? So tell the Luddite in the room what that is.
Well, no,
they're looking at each other, ganging up on me.
I'm rubbing my hand.
But it's a really common mistake to the point that the art director and the animation director correct that repeatedly in their interviews, in their own sort of writing about the film, that it's not rotoscope, it's digital cutout animation. There's sort of, so if you, do you want to...
Well, no, my notes, I mean, obviously we've talked a bit about the animation. I guess from where I'm coming from was the idea about the technique, the way that it looks, and it's very kind of graphic in lots of ways we might interpret that word. I was interested in the use of black lines, I think, around the drawings. There's something very obviously kind of comic book about that, but we can put pressure on that.
Before you explain to me what this thing that I've already forgotten the name of is, so clearly I've learned well.
Excellent. You can listen back to the podcast.
There are moments where we have the sort of talking, it looks a lot more like a sort of traditional quote-unquote documentary, where we have the talking heads, we have things going on in the background that are supposed to suggest that what we are seeing happened once, right? That this is in some way an indexical, sort of Bazinian footprint on what has been seen, but then it's being redone.
My notes on that are about, I guess, photorealism and the reference points to lens-based media. So the drool of the dogs at the start that gets flicked onto the camera lens. Like, I love little things like that, and the film is bookended by two moments like that. The drool on the screen, if you like, or the camera's lens, and then the lens flare at the end, and the lens flare then leads into the kind of climactic sequence, which is very powerful in all kinds of ways. So in terms of the technique, it's interesting that you said that they often correct it, because I was thinking about this film in relation to something like Waking Life or A Scanner Darkly, so films that use digital rotoscope or Rotoshop. But in this case, as you say, it's kind of some of it is hand drawn. I think some of it is classic. Is that right? Or some of it
there are
is,
a couple of bits in it that are.
But mostly it's kind of digital cutouts where bodies are fragmented into different component parts digitally, and then they're moved to give the illusion of. Is that kind of right? Is that how you understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think of it as like the analogy of doing it in 2D, like using bits of paper, that you would cut out the bits of the body and then articulate them with joints at the elbow, at the wrist, or whatever, and then you move those separate parts individually to create movement. It's just doing that process, just doing that process digitally,
just doing that
where
process.
you separate it and you sort of move it that way. So that's how why the animation has that slightly clunky movement at the time, which I think adds to the dreamlike. Well, I've written about this, how it sort of adds to the dreamlike quality of it. That sort of this sort of slightly stilted movement of the characters.
There's something very floating. I feel like the film itself seems to take the aesthetic of floating in the water. One of the powerful images of the movie. The whole film seems like it's kind of floating on, and that's one of the criticisms, I guess, in some pieces that are levelled at that digital rotoscoping, where you paint over live action footage digitally, that there's a sort of slipperiness between the live action and the digital on top of it. I know that I think Paul Ward and Caroline Ruddle have written on A Scanner Darkly, or certainly on Rotoshop and stuff like that. So the whole film has that sort of looseness, but I agree, I think it's quite. There's a fantasy to the aesthetic in an interesting way.
And I think it's partly to do with the sort of weight. It's like the characters don't have any weight, or sort of any of the sort of normal squash and stretch. I think this is right that animated characters might normally have.
Well, I know that certainly in a digital context, and we will get to talking about the film at some point, but or the plot, I should say. Yeah. But the idea of volume is really difficult, and weight is something in CG, which is, and I know the filmmakers, when Pixar were making The Incredibles, obviously you're trying to show a group of superheroes that in some cases have superhuman strength. Well, how do you create strength and bodies that have, or objects that are so voluminous and weighty that a character needs to be straining to, and everything is wireframe and everything is virtual, and so the idea of volume and weight and density in digital is something that's really, it's kind of sort of interesting, I think.
Can I just go back to something you said, Alex, that I think was really interesting, is the idea that for you, in some sequences, it was clear that they were meant to be more connected to reality than in others, because I think that...
Well, I mean, that word reality is obviously slightly charged, but certainly sort of objective reality, physical reality. I'm using Bazanian terms here, right? But
I think that one of the things that I think is really interesting about the film is that the animation... So there are three different registers the film works in. There are the interviews, which for the most part, they are... The director, he filmed himself interviewing people, the real people, in most instances, not all instances. So those are reconstructed in the animation. So those really happened. And then there's the memories of the past, the reconstruction of the past, and then there's the fantasy sequences. But they're all animated in the same style. So there's no sort of aesthetic distinction, really, between those three different registers. And that's something that the filmmakers did consciously, because they didn't want to have any sense of privileging any one of those elements over the other in terms of significance, reality, meaning, or any of those things. I mean, there is aesthetic difference, I think, in terms of colour palette and other things.
The colours are fantastic.
The colour's really important in this, especially in the repeated dream sequence. But so it's interesting how you sort of glean that difference between the sort of more realistic sections.
That's very nicely articulated, because I couldn't. That's exactly it. Like the three, there are moments of memory which, by all means, are seeming to be, there's no hallucinogenic moments, there's no moments of metamorphosis, there's no great big fantasy monsters or beasts or visions coming out of anywhere, but it's obviously someone's subjective memory, and I don't think the film is making any claim at that moment to be showing something that they've actually got any kind of documented evidence of, other than the stories people are telling. But then there are the moments, as you say, in the talking heads, where you've got a child walks in the background, and there's these sort of almost like real life is passing by moments that do feel like, I didn't know that, but it's nice to know that some bits were actually filmed, and then they use that as reference.
They filmed the interview, I think this is right, they filmed the interviews in a studio. So like the sequence you're talking about, which is like the interviews with his psychologist friend Ari, I don't know that they would have filmed those in his house. I think he had people interviewed in a studio for sound quality reasons.
Interesting. So actually, even that is a fantasy to sort of be a bit buzzwordy about it.
Yeah, and if you think about that sequence, there is also that you sort of get that one of those sequences with the interview with Ori, because it sort of morphs into a fantasy sequence where you get the superimposition of the Ferris wheel and the fairground sequence in the background when they're talking about the sort of the impressionability of memory.
And how you can fabricate memory. Yeah. But as you said, it morphs into the fantasy, but then, as you said, the visual register often doesn't give that away.
Yeah.
And so everything sort of slips into each other. And I'm looking at the cast, so as you say, some of the cast are playing themselves, but some people are playing real people, presumably, and so there are lots of registers visually, but
even orally
there are lots of different ways in which we can try and make sense, and this is why the film's a riddle, I think, for us, as trying to sit down and figure out how to approach it.
Well, to deliciously segue into talking about the sort of the mechanics of the narration, I guess, I was struck by that in the opening sequence, in that we get this opening nightmare sequence of these sort of dogs running through the street, which is very sort of atmospheric and evocative, and then the camera pans up I think it pans up into a bar where we get the story of the dogs, and we get the whole sort of plot momentum cracking in, and I was interested that they did it via this sort of allusion to a camera, as if like we're panning up from the dogs straight to the bar. They're in the same world, they're in the same space, whilst at the same time we get the story about the dream that acknowledges that what we just saw was a dream at the same time as it being happening outside on the street. So
well, I suppose writing on the film, its relationship to the mind and cinema as mind, and how film functions as a mind or a brain, because in the way that you cut things together in your mind as part of a memory, and you edit as you go, and you create. This is why we could risk saying the thing that we always say, which is the film is about animation. I actually don't think it's about animation. I think it's about narration more than anything else, and about the way of telling stories. But the film operates as a kind of mind, and you kind of edit, and absolutely there are certain moments in the film where, rather than a cut, they just have really smooth camera movement through the woods or something, and through these trees, and now we're at a different location at a different time, and everything is really connected, which I'd not really thought about before. But
it's true, and I can't remember how they segue into the first, so the important dream hallucination sequence of the film of Ari Folman's, which is his connection to what happened to him in the war. And I can't remember how they segue to that visually, but is it through like a pan out to the sea, and then we pan down onto... And the thing about camera perspective, I think, is also really interesting, because the point of view of the camera in that repeated dream sequence is interesting, and I think helps evoke the idea of it being a kind of out-of-body experience, because of how it switches from a third-person kind of overhead view of Ari Folman and the other people in the sea with him to sort of then adopting his point of view later in the sequence.
Yeah, well, there's something in terms of the segueing. Aren't there bits where he's looking out to then what becomes the dream or something? Trying to get an anchor point is quite difficult, as if you're in a dream. But actually, the role of perspective and proximity. So, the opening sequence with the dogs, you are placed closer because of the illusion of the camera, and they have the fake construction of the lens that's there, and there's a sense of proximity, and you're in the action, and then suddenly the camera goes right up, and then you're in a bar that isn't isn't connected in that way, and then you figure out you're in a sort of false opening frame and you're in a story, and that which is a playful kind of technique. And then the film goes through quite a series of sort of structures, a journey narrative effectively, as he tries to find out what happened and why he's forgetting things, and how his memories become fabricated, and then these sorts of things. So then the film goes into quite a series of conversation pieces, really, and as he meets various people and tries to piece together his experience. And then we have repeated scenes, as you said, like the dream sequence where they're in the water and next in the water and moving out. So it's a sort of, it jumps back and forth, and it's all done very fluidly. But I've not thought about that fluidity between the kind of temporal registers of the film before. So
are we saying that this is sort of documenting a traumatic mind struggling with memory? Is that... I'm interested in what the film's documenting.
I don't think it's documenting anything.
Right.
I think.
So is it a documentary then?
Well, documentaries don't just document, and I think that one of the ways that I've written about animated documentary is the idea that animation can do something in a documentary context that live action film can't, which is that it can evoke experiences, subjectivities, mental health issues, whatever it might be, from a first-person perspective in a way that live-action film can't. So I think that that's what this film is doing. I think it's working in sort of two registers in terms of animated documentary, and one of them is this evocation of the experience of forgetting, or the experience of the effect that the trauma has had on him. And so that means that's to do with the remembering and the forgetting and coming to terms with his role in the massacre in the camps. So I think one of the productive things when you think about animated documentary is to get away from that idea of documentaries documenting, because they don't. I think that sort of can be, it can be maybe a bit too limiting when you think about what animation is doing. Because if you wed yourself to the idea that documentary is going to only document, then you're sort of short-circuiting any real conversation about animation in a documentary context.
Well, unless we broaden what document means.
Sure, that's the same thing, right?
I don't know. I guess I'm interested in, like, if it doesn't document anything and does all these other things as well. Why have these? I mean, maybe that's the point. Why have these sort of fiction, non-fiction classification? Maybe we should just call it non-fiction rather than documentary. Is this a term that's perhaps seeped in celluloid and all this sort of stuff as a form of classification, or am I rambling?
You're just annoyed that you said rotoscoping. You're still just...
I'm still annoyed. I am still annoed about it.
Yeah, I know you are. I can see it in your eyes.
And I'm going to be annoyed about it for about 48 hours. But we power through the trauma of that.
I think there's lots of issues with the term documentary and what that actually means. And I mean, it's a bit like animation. Like, how do we define animation? How do we define documentary? The creative treatment of actuality is the most long-standing definition of documentary, which is John Grierson's definition of documentary. Creative treatment of actuality. Then animation fits in that just as well as reenactments, interviews, archival material, all the other kind of elements in the documentary filmmaker's toolbox. And so, is documentary's responsibility just to document things that have happened, or is it to tell us things about the real world? Okay, so I mean that's another distinction that Bill Nichols makes in documentary. Documentary is about the world, and fiction film is about a world. I think that's a really useful distinction to make in terms of this film, because it's about the world as is experienced by these people, or specifically by Ari Folman, and it's about their perspective of their experience in this conflict. It's not about a world, it's not a made-up story, and it's not... So in that sense, coming back to the fantasy, distinction is quite interesting, because I think that's how Bill Nichols distinguishes between documentary and not documentary, which is the world, as opposed to a world like Star Wars, like a made-up fantasy world.
Sure. Time to pause the podcast for just a moment, folks. We at fantasy-animation.org publish weekly blog posts that highlight a certain aspect of the relationship between fantasy cinema and animation by a particular writer each week, looking at their own interests.
Absolutely. We've got chances for people to publish on particular films, television programmes. We'd love to hear from you if you have a particular sequence from your favourite film or television programme that you want to talk about. If you've read a book on fantasy and animation, if you've been to an event, a conference, or even a festival, we'd love to hear hear from you. If you've got something to say about fantasy and animation in the form of an editorial, these can be an interpretation, reflection of an idea or concept, anything that connects up fantasy and animation together. From creative practitioners to more philosophical readings, we'd love to hear from you.
So examples of previous blog posts have included a range of items from a look at Soho cinema practice and the relationship between fantasy in animation studios working in the London area.
We've got work on particular studios, whether it's the Leica studios, whether it's the Pixar studios, whether it's the DreamWorks studios. We've got thoughts on animated documentaries.
We've got reviews of Captain Marvel, the new Dumbo movie, as well as reflections on How to Train Your Dragon and its engagement with queer theory. Any kind of angle you want to come at this from, we'd be open to hearing ideas. We don't have a deadline, we operate on a rolling submission process. All you need to do is get in contact with us on the website under the How to Contribute tab or the Contact Us tab. It's easy to find and we're waiting to hear from you.
So this is something interesting there then about that if documentary is the creative treatment of actuality and that animation is one of those creative tools, representational strategies
Nice.
to cite a chapter in your book, but the animation is a strategy to do this, then the film itself becomes a creative treatment of history, regardless of whether it was animation or not. If it was live action and done through dreams, it would become a subjective treatment of actuality, i.e. his personal experience of a particular event. The animation adds to that narrative because it is in of itself a creative treatment of something, because animation is rhetorical, and so it works really nicely in the film that is itself about the kind of falsity of memory or memory reflection, and the fact that both of those things can be false and unreliable. So animation fits really nicely because it's artificial, and actually that maybe feeds into the style of the film, which really makes no claims to be absolutely convincing in the way that it looks. It always retains its animatedness as a way of signalling that process of reenactment.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting, one of you guys said earlier about photorealism, and so I've sort of grappled
That was me.
I grapple with that in this film, because I think it is sort of realistic in that, the people in the film, the ones that are represented to look like themselves, you can recognise them, right? So you can see the animated Ari Folman, and then you see a picture of him in a real photograph, and you're like, oh yeah, I can see I can see that's the same person, even though his animated version is slightly better looking than his real life version.
Yeah, just by accident, presumably. Just by accident.
So yes, but it's not photorealistic in the sense that something like I don't know, Walking with Dinosaurs, something else I've written about, in the sense that was sort of trying to look like filmed imagery. It's not trying to look like filmed imagery. There is no pretense here that this isn't animation, and I think it really trades in that sort of graphic novel style.
But then that moment where, and we're still on the opening, but when the dog sort of flicks the drool onto then it's weird because it's a sort of creative treatment of photorealism. Yeah,
which actually, funnily enough, quite a lot of animated documentaries that work in this register do. So, in fact, Walking with Dinosaurs, but Walking with Dinosaurs does that as well. So there's nothing other than it's sort of this sense of a pretense that if the camera was there, could have recorded this is what it would have looked like, and a sort of way of kind of making parity between animation and reality, or almost kind of making a claim for animation's validity as a representational strategy in documentary. And I think that's what's going on here.
So I've in the context of computer animated feature films, that they do that a lot as well. They kind of do fake. And I think what it is that photorealism is a term that's been described to articulate how animation, and mostly digital animation, can replicate lens-based media. But it doesn't tell us anything about how it's then used for political purposes, i.e. how it is used to make people laugh. Like when a character smacks into the camera lens in a movie like, I don't know, Monsters Inc. or whatever, or How to Train Your Dragon, then we laugh at it because DVD special features tell us that that's not how those films were made. So photorealism tells us an aesthetic, but it doesn't tell us the kind of purpose. So here, that photorealism is being co-opted into a sort of register about the validity of animation to document history or to document something.
Exactly, and it's quite covert, I think. I don't think that unless you're watching the film closely, you would notice that. And there are there was a film by Brett Morgan called Chicago 10 that was released a few years before this, and it's a documentary, but it uses lots of animation. It reenacts sequences of a courtroom, court case. And that film also uses strategy to make parity between the animated sequences and the archival footage by doing things like dressing the animated characters in the same outfits you can see them in archival footage, even though they are not footage from the same time period or the same day. So I think there are these sort of really subtle strategies that these films use that are a way of kind of implicitly making the claim for animation's validity. But unlike those examples from the computer animation, they're not meant to be noticed in a way. They're not like sort of a gag that is meant to kind of take us out of the moment. No. Quite the opposite.
From my perspective, I guess this is sort of, I wonder if what the film does is encourage the spectator to think about this sort of relationship between animation and live action, and the way in which animation is used as a representational base, and then sometimes as an imaginative sort of calling card or whatever, for want of a better term. For me, it sort of folds in with quite a lot of psychological theories that we sort of alluded to earlier, which are very much about sort of what is reality if it's not a split, if it's not a culmination of the raw, real, unobserved, unmediated through human consciousness mixed with human subjectivity to create something meaningful that is reality. And that's quite often how fantasy is sort of seen. As fantasy is a necessary condition to create a coherent picture of reality, because reality unfiltered is, to get all postmodern, the real. It's trauma, or it's not even meaning. It's nothing. So in a way, the film's playing with different modes of meaning making, and sometimes the sort of the real is pushed aside in favour of the imaginary, and sometimes the imaginary is folded on the top or scattered on the top like a delicious
icing
on
sprinkles.
Icing on a real cake. Wow. But I think it's deliberately trying to get you to sort of play with that seesaw, or at least I was playing with that seesaw whilst watching it. But I might just be obsessed with fantasy.
To me, the film is not sort of. I think it's actually resisting that idea of kind of sprinkling reality as icing on top of it, or the other way around. Because I think for me, the film is really trying to equate these three different registers of experience, of subjective experience, as equally truthful. That's the word the filmmakers use in terms of the significance of this event for these people, specifically for Ari Folman, i.e., in terms of coming to terms with what that experience means for his identity, for his connection with history or whatever it is. Those hallucinations are as, his hallucination or his kind of dream sequence of the C sequence that's repeated 3 times are as meaningful as his encounters with the people through the interviews, some of whom he knows, some of whom were strangers to him until he did the interviews, are as meaningful as the quote-unquote real memories he has from that experience, from that time. So I think those are all, we're meant to think, I think, as an audience, that they're all equally as important and equally truthful.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily mean to hierarchize them. I just think there had to be different forms of meaning making, in that there are some moments in this film that wrestle with dreams and what dreams mean, and some moments that seem much more interested in memory, and it does make a distinction between those, I think, in the visual register, and we make a distinction by having 2 words to describe 2 different things, right? One is, both are forms of meaning making, but they are different forms of meaning making, and we don't have to.
I mean, you get lines there are lines about soldiers talking about that they wanted to forget, at the same time as Folman himself is trying to get a kind of quote unquote full picture. And so there are the different characters of the film have different memories, and together there's a full picture, but each individual character has forgotten some bits, and there are claims to truth in other bits, and I wonder whether there's something in the way that the film, certainly it animates posters, and it animates simulates time-lapse footage, which I think is interesting, when the guy's playing the guitar on the beach, but he's using his gun to play the guitar, and then you have like a time-lapse. So it is about the kind of consumption of information and how information is communicated to us, and then ultimately how we then end up forgetting certain things. And so, but I think the memory and dreams bit is replicated in some people are trying to dream of what happened and remember, and other people are trying to forget.
But it's also about the importance of forgetting, and how forgetting itself is meaningful. So if you think about the film as being, and this is actually one of the reasons, we can talk about this later, maybe it's, the film's received a lot of criticism for this, but it's about the post-traumatic stress disorder of Ari Folman, of the other people who fought in the Israeli Defense Forces, and So you may know more about this than I do, but if you think about how memory and forgetting and PTSD has been written about by scholars such as Cathy Carruth, and the importance of these gaps and then these hallucinations that come back in to fill the gaps that are repeated and kind of unprocessable. For me, it's a film that is it's more about memory and forgetting than it is about history or that event in historical time, because as the film has been criticised for, it tells the story from the perspective of, from a very particular perspective, and sort of
not the characters that the film ends with.
Not the characters that the film ends with, and has been accused of sort of working to absolve the guilt of Folman and other young men who fought in the IDF and sort of the role they played in it.
So does that raise the question about animation? Is one well suited to that sort of elliptical way that memory and dreams work, of course? But broadly, it seems to me that the film is criticised on the basis of that it was a kind of, as you say, absolving, but animation is a cathartic medium where he can just, so it's fine now, and that's that, and he's rinsed away, or I don't know, is that where the arguments lie?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's sort of how I initially read the film, was this kind of a cathartic process. I mean, I think that's how he sets the film up at the beginning, is he's going on this journey, as you suggested, and it is this kind of cathartic process and I think that's signalled by the end of the film and that very short live action sequence, archival footage sequence at the end of the film, that he's got resolution, he's got closure.
I think we have lots to say about that.
I don't know what I've got to say about that, but I've got lots to say. But I think that the only final thing is the only role of fantasy that we haven't perhaps articulated is the role of fantasy as a mask behind the real, right? So actually, what a lot of this is also doing is this idea that we use fantasy to avoid the traumatic truth of it, and which
if animation is a fantastic medium, then does animation become? So I had a question about whether it dilutes or exaggerates. So are we saying that the animation is part of that masking? To do it in animation
I wonder if the ending seems to set us up to almost think that, right? In that the ending sort of has this final moment of clarity for the protagonist that involves live action, and it seems to be implying, to me at least, that there's been some role of animation as a concealment or a mask. And there's a line in it about like a screen and watching, observing the war like you were watching it through a camera, and then suddenly the camera goes away. And I think he seems to be implying that's what happens at the end to the protagonist and supposedly to us. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, so I show this film to students a lot, and it has obviously a very strong effect on them, but we talk a lot about that last segment and whether it in some way undermines the hour and a half of animation that came before, that you don't sort of realise that the importance of all this until you get that archival footage at the end. I don't know, I mean, I think narratively that archival footage works as closure, right? He's regained his memory, he understands the significance of his role in that, in the massacre of the camps, and he's sort of like, he's solved the riddle of his dream sequence, his repeated dream sequence, because it's that live action material, that archival material is deeply connected to the final, it happens at the end of the final time you see that dream sequence played through, and you're allowed to see that dream sequence play all the way through, all the way out, and you kind of understand, you get a camera turning around onto him, and you understand how all these elements of that dream sequence connect to each other. So it is narratively this moment of resolution, but aesthetically there is that question of how does it relate to the animation? And so my students often say, well, that's what made them realise it was real. Before then they didn't know like how much of the film was real, how much of this was really happened, and then that kind of brought it all home to them. So it has this kind of like, it packs this punch at the end of the film of like, look, this is really real.
But I suppose that if the film is making that fluidity between different time periods or different memories and reality and doing it through these, is it also suggesting that there's no difference between the two?
That's how I've written about the film.
That it's so smooth in the way that you have the final kind of bit of animated footage which has a lens flare, which is again a little nod to indexical lens-based media and so forth. And then we seem to move quite smoothly into the live action footage in a way that suggests that there's no seam at all. But Alex is looking at me in a way that suggests that I'm wrong.
I don't. You're often wrong, Chris.
Well, yes.
But no, I am. I don't find that moment smooth as a viewer. I find that I wasn't. It's a jarring, shocking moment that sort of brings you out of it, and I don't know what it's saying about the role of animation up until that point.
So what I've said is that I don't think that ending would have anywhere near as much impact if you'd had the hour and a half if you hadn't had the hour and a half of animation before, right? So that end sequence is less than a minute and a half, only makes sense in the context of that animation.
Sure.
Yeah, if you could show it by itself, it would have a completely different meaning. So I think that it doesn't negate the animation that's gone before at all, but I think it works closely in conjunction with it to help us understand the significance of the animation, perhaps. Also, it still works to make that parity between the animation and quote-unquote reality, so that in the sequence briefly before that, you've heard the war correspondent talking about going into the camps. Yeah, he's one of the first people who goes in with his camera, and he sees the girl with the black curly hair.
Yeah.
And he stops because she looks a lot like his daughter, and it sort of really brings it home to him. And you see an animated reconstruction of the little girl with her hair sticking out of the rubble. And then you see that again in live action in the archival footage at the end, right? So it's in a way, for me, that is sort of not authenticating, but sort of bolstering the significance and the meaning of the animation that we saw before. It's sort of connecting them together and making a parity between the two. It sort of reconstructs it almost from exactly the same angle.
I'm just trying to think of your talk out about the stuff that you said previously about obviously animation, fantasy as an impulse, and a way to think about fantasy not in generic terms but as an impulse that is available to lots of different films. And we've talked about Grease. The ending of Grease, where it's all pretty much realistic, and then the car flies away, and you're like, oh, okay, so fantasy is an impulse. It's a thing that can happen in ostensibly live action. This is like the reverse of that, because it's like fancy, or if we take fantasy and animation to be closely overlapped, as we tend to do, this is the opposite effect, that reality is an impulse in the film.
Yeah, I like that.
And articulated through...
It's a sort of real bullet at the end, like real in the sort of, capital R sense of the word.
So fantasy isn't the only thing that need be an impulse. Realist is a sort of impetus, or realism is an impulse in this movie.
I guess I think the only thing I think perhaps that I think might be a bit of a shame in that, and this is probably just coming from my own research bias, is that I spend a lot of time writing about how fantasy, how the role fantasy plays in our own well-being and our own sense of reality, and trying to get away from a sort of Freudian notion that our fantasies are the things that haunt us, and if only we can be expunged of our fantasies, we will arrive closer at an understanding of reality. And there's this sort of very, within fantasy circles, famous Freudian discussion of the Fort Dar game, which is this kid dropping, basically playing peekaboo. And basically enacting a trauma through fantasy, and again and again and again until the trauma has worked its way through, and then they can see reality fully. And it's full of this kind of discourse of let's get rid of our fantasy so we can see reality better. And I wonder if the film doesn't sort of at least implicitly suggest that we reach a point of resolution at the end because the concealment that animation provides, that fantasy provides, is now lifted from the protagonist's eyes, so we're at a moment of better reality, of more of truth, and that's coupled with this influx of live action, which I think does, from my perspective, seems to suggest that fantasy can't help us be real, and also seems to suggest that animation helps us be real by concealing it for a long time and then sort of revealing it at the end.
Pay no attention to the medium behind the camera.
Yeah, sort of that kind of thing. Again, I think there is that line that's said in it about seeing a thing through a camera and then the camera drops away, and I feel like that's what it's trying to get us to do. Is at the end the camera drops away. Of course, it doesn't, but animation drops away.
But that last sequence doesn't tell us the story of the film.
No.
Because that's not what the film is about, really. The film is about him coming to terms with the role he played in the Shabran Shatila camp massacre. But it's also, the film is really about that journey, right? And it's about the importance of those three different elements of fantasy, of memory, of reality, or current day exchanges, in coming to terms with that memory. So I suppose a lot of it depends on what you think the film is about.
Sure.
Yeah. So if you think the film is about that moment in history, then yeah, I would agree with you that it's about the animation, kind of the curtain falling away. But if we think about the film as being about something else, then no, I don't think. I think the animation, the status of animation remains important because you couldn't make a film about the importance of forgetting, memory, fantasy, hallucination, without using animation.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. I just wonder if it doesn't therefore say that these dreams, these memories, these hallucinations ultimately obscure rather than help reveal. And I'm very much of a mindset that says that these things help us to grapple with reality rather than hinder us from doing so.
I think that's what the film is saying.
Okay, I think it is until those last 90 seconds.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure if that's what it's saying. And it's such an impactful 90 seconds that one can't help. It feels both unfair and sort of necessary to place the two in dialogue, because it's such a sort of...
Yeah.
Because it places them in dialogue in other ways it places this idea of animation's proximity to live action. It does it through those moments that you don't notice. The camera work in some cases is classical, but then isn't in others, or the lens flare, and then its proximity to live action is fully revealed at the end.
To me, in a way, the other way to read that final sequence, well, there are several other ways. One way to read it is to say, look, I could have shown you this the whole way through the film, but that would not have told you the story that I want to tell you in this film. That's one way to read it, I think, which sort of rehabilitates the animation. And another way is, I think there was some kind of ethical obligation and feeling of duty on, and maybe sort of a pre-acknowledgement of the criticism the film was going to receive about the perspective and the story it tells by, giving it over to the sort of to those people and to that story at the end, I think.
Because if the film is about recollection and being unable to recall, then the film is then suggesting there are two ways to recall. One is because it's live action footage, but that is a way of recording something. And the same way animation is a way of recording. When he meets the psychologist or has that discussion with the psychologist and they talk about dissociative events, I got animation's role as one to dilute the history and make it more palatable, to exaggerate it by virtue of the fact we are seeing blood done in ostensibly children's medium, and then the third is seems to be your point, Alex, about it disassociates us from it ever so slightly. So there's something, it would be interesting to pay more attention, and I wish I'd done so, to the actual conversations that he has, because the dialogue is very, very charged in that sense, talking about memory and trauma and a line, so what you can't remember. And the failure of memory and stuff. And so I'm wondering whether ways of, because we see this animated simulation of live action footage on a television screen. We see the simulation of time-lapse footage, lens flare, posters, different media, and then at the very end you have another way of remembering. So I see your point about it being jarring, but I suppose the other way is that look how equal they are. It's the Who Framed Roger Rabbit thing. Yeah. The live action walking, or the animation walking into live action. Go look, they share the same world, and yet the whole film's about how they're totally different things. And I wonder whether this film is which one's Roger Rabbit and which one's Eddie Valiant. Yeah,
and I think in a way that final sequence just points to the inadequacy of live action.
Ah, interesting. Rather than reclaiming it as the real way to show it.
I mean, I think that's you can make that argument. That he will have seen that footage, presumably Ari Folman, before, but it didn't help him understand what role he played in that massacre. So he needed to go through this animated journey to figure out, what role he played. And so that live action footage is never enough on its own.
And by going through the process, then it becomes meaningful, that final moment. Yeah, I like that reading. I'm going to try and make that what I believe, but I certainly prefer it.
On that last I guess the final sequence before we wrap things up, we have the dissolve to live action footage. So my first note was, so is the animation that can't do it justice, but only live action can. And then I thought, it's interesting, the live action footage doesn't have subtitles. And the animated footage does. And I was like, I don't know what that means. Yeah. I don't know what that means, but it might mean something or it might mean nothing. But I thought that's really interesting because there's no way of us to understand what's going on. It really feels like a punch. There's something there that we don't understand what these people are saying. We get a good idea, but it's not subtitled. And then we obviously get the freeze. The film ends on a freeze frame, and then the music just because the music is quite consistent in the film, and the use of Enola Gay, how amazing. But then you just get beats, dum dum, and the screen goes to black, and suddenly you're like, whoa, this is there now. And so I really didn't know what to make sense. It's really interesting to that we had different readings of the end because I kind of don't know what to make of it really.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I've got to say about that.
I don't know what to make about it. We'll climb back out of the film. So, Bella, should we do more documentaries, or is this a particular instance of a documentary that's interested in things that we are interested in on this podcast?
No, you could do lots more documentaries, animated documentaries. I think there might even be a blog post on your blog.
A very fine one, I believe.
About the intersection of animation, documentary and fantasy.
Absolutely.
And it definitely, for me, your research and your fantasy animation blog has made me think about animated documentary from a different perspective. And I remember asking you guys the question a long time ago when I first encountered your research of where does this leave? If fantasy implies animation, and animation implies fantasy, where does that leave animated documentary? So I think it's a really interesting way of articulating sort of some really prescient questions about animated documentary and vice versa. And there are plenty of animated documentaries that engage or deal with this world of the subjective, of memory, of the importance of fantasy, all the things we've been talking about for your own understanding of yourself and the world. So
and your point about Chicago 10 and how that we haven't really talked about voice performance in Waltz with Bashir, but it seems to me that Chicago 10 is another animated documentary, but it uses star voices, and whether that upsets. And I suppose that gets us into broader questions that the people that have written about the biopic, I guess, have also interrogated the creative treatment of Freddie Mercury's life or whatever it might be, that there is something, the voice in these films feel very authentic.
Right, which they are for the most part. A couple of them are re-recorded. But so my question about this film is often, so I watch it with the subtitles in the original language.
Yeah.
But you can get a version that's dubbed in English. Right. So what does that then mean? Because then you've got dubbed audio and you've got animated visuals. Yeah. And so you've lost that quote-unquote indexical link with reality, which an animated documentary often is through the soundtrack. And the recorded voices.
You should edit a book on that.
Yeah.
But then that gives more emphasis. If you watch the dubbed version, that gives more emphasis, presumably, to the live-action footage at the end in that version.
I don't know.
That's a moment that wouldn't be dubbed. That would be a powerful people speaking in their own voices, if you like. Although I suppose maybe there is that that moment at the end where we just get to hear the people speaking in their own voices. But why is that not subtitled? I've never thought about that question before. Why is that not subtitled? It's a really interesting question. I think it has a lot to do with whose story this film privileges.
Yeah. Okay. I have really strong opinions on dubbing and subtitles, so I defer to
a future blog post, perhaps.
But it does mean that we might get to do Walking with Dinosaurs sometimes.
Oh, please.
Can
I come back? Can I come back?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got so much to say about animated dinosaurs.
Oh, brilliant! Before we say goodbye, we normally ask people where they can find you. So can people find you online? Can they find you? Come to your house. Maybe rather than give out your address,
please don't come to my house.
Yeah.
I am on Twitter irregularly at Bella Honess Roe. I have a University of Surrey webpage. I have a blog on animated documentary that I have not updated for years, but it forms a kind of sort of archive, if you like, of a certain moment, a snapshot of animated documentary research. Which I've sort of pretty much stopped updating now, but it has some resources and information there.
And if people are really interested about this topic and they wanted to get your book, that's available still?
Animated documentary is available on all good online booksellers at a very reasonable price for paperback.
And what's interesting about it is that previous podcasts we've talked about the role of skeletons in animation, and the front cover of your book.
It has a skeleton from Jonathan Hodgson's film Feeling My Way.
There we go. Nice little synergy there between fantasy/animation/skeletons.
Yeah.
Well, Bella, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to us about Waltz with Bashir. We are Fantasy Animation, fantasy-animation.org. You can find us on Twitter at FanAnimResearch, FANANIM Research, as well as on Facebook. And we look forward to taking part in the conversations that this podcast provides. Thanks very much for listening.
Bye.